Before you're able to use your terminal servers, you obviously need to license them. Now, as we saw when we installed terminal services though, you do get 120 days grace to use terminal services before you need to install your licenses. Now, when I say 120 days, I mean you get 120 days. On the last day, you simply won't be able to connect to your terminal server if you haven't licensed it. So whilst you can simply delay configuring a licensed server for quite a while, there'll come a point when you need to install your licensed server or risk not being able to connect. So obviously, it's a good idea to set this all up as soon as possible to avoid any downtime. Now, one thing I probably should mention is that if you haven't installed your licensing server yet, it's worth knowing that you don't actually have to install it on your terminal servers themselves. You can install it on a totally separate server if that's what you want to do. Just make sure that your terminal servers are able to talk to it, as obviously they're going to need to be able to talk to it in order to remain fully licensed. So when we talk about these terminal services licenses, we've got two types. We can purchase a per device license or per user license. Now, as the name suggests, for our devices, a per device license allows you to purchase a single license for each device that needs to access our terminal server. So if you've got a laptop that needs access to a terminal server, that's one license. Maybe you've got obviously a desktop computer that needs to connect, well, that's another license there. Maybe you've got a mobile device like a PDA or a Windows smartphone, and of course, that's another device. So this sort of license is particularly good when you might have a lot of people that share hardware. So, for example, let's say you've got a lot of shift workers and they'll rotate their shifts several times a day. So the first shift comes in and they use the computers at the desk and they're going to go home later that day. Someone else is going to come in and use that same computer. Well, in that case, a per device license seems like a pretty good idea. Now, on the other hand, a per user license is required for each user to access our terminal servers. So each user that needs access to the terminal server will need a license regardless of the number of devices they have. So if our user here happens to have a laptop, well, there's one device. He might also have the same, a desktop. That's another one. And of course, well, let's just say he's got the same devices here. He's got a PDA or a smartphone and so on and so forth. Well, that's 3 devices already, but we've only got the one user who's using them. So in this case, instead of buying 3 device licenses, you can just buy 1 user license, and that might work out to be a little cheaper. So once you've decided what licenses you need to purchase, you're obviously going to have to get them from Microsoft or one of their resellers. And once you've paid for that, they'll give you a code, which you'll need to punch into your licensing server, and those licenses will be automatically issued to your license server. Now, I must admit up front, though, that I don't have any client access licenses that I can use here in my lab, mainly because it's not really practical for me to go out and buy a bunch of licenses just to demonstrate how to activate them. Unfortunately, I don't get paid nowhere near enough to be able to do that. So for this video, we're just going to have to use our imagination and take some things on face value. But in this video, we're certainly going to see how we can go about licensing our server. It's really easy anyway, and if you do have real licenses, then you're going to have no problems. Okay, so we've switched over to our terminal server here, and remember, we installed all of the roles on this machine, so our licensing role is already going to be here. So if you haven't done this yet, make sure that you view our installation video where we show you how you can install the license server role. So we're going to click Start, and if we go to our administrative tools here, and up the top you'll note we've got this Terminal Services folder, and in here you're going to find our Terminal Services Licensing Manager console. So let's fire that up. And obviously the first thing you're going to notice here is that we've got this red X showing us that our server's not yet activated. So we'll need to fix it up in a moment. You'll also note over here that our discovery scope is set to domain, something we set when we first installed this licensing server. Now, if you do want to change this, by the way, you can do this by clicking this review link. Now, when I installed my licensing server role service on this machine, I deliberately chose to do it on this server and put the discovery scope as domain for one reason. Now, I wanted you to see this message that appears right here when you choose to install this component on a member server like I did. This license server is not installed on a domain controller, and terminal servers in the domain won't be able to automatically discover this license server. Okay, so that right there is a pretty good reason to think about where you're going to install your license server. Now, if you want your terminal servers to automatically discover the license server, then you've got a couple of options. You either need to install the role service on your domain controller, that's one option, or we can change this from a discovery scope of domain to a forest-wide scope. But regardless, if we wanted to keep this as it currently is, we still can configure our terminal servers to find this license server manually. Now that's fine, it's going to work just great, and since I only have one server anyway, it's certainly not a big deal. But if you've got 20 terminal servers, then it probably will be a big deal. Now I could also easily remove this licensing role from this server and install it on my domain controller, but I'm not going to do that. I'll leave it here, it's fine. And like I mentioned a moment ago, we could choose to publish this to Active Directory anyway by simply changing our scope to forest-wide. So in this section below here, it tells us that our license server is a member of the domain and it will be able to issue licenses to users in our domain. But if we want to change the scope so that our terminal servers could access this server forest-wide, then we'll need to come up to the top here and click this Change Scope button. It'll then tell us that we'll need to be an enterprise admin to do this, no problem. We'll click Continue, and we can now make that change if we like. So let's set this to Forest. You'll note I can't choose Workgroup because obviously we're in a domain right now. So we'll set it to Forest, we'll click OK. We'll get a confirmation of our change. Well, let's click OK again, and note now what it says. The license server is now published in Active Directory Domain Services, and terminal servers in the forest can automatically discover this license server. Great. And that's really what we want. So let's click OK. And our configuration up here has now changed to say the discovery scope is forest. But obviously at this point, we still haven't activated our licensing server. So to activate this server, we'll need to right click on our server and choose Activate Server. And that's going to start up the Activate Server wizard. Let's click Next. We'll now need to choose how we're going to contact the Microsoft Clearinghouse to activate our server. Will we do that automatically over the internet? Now that, of course, requires that this licensing server does have internet access. We could do it via a web browser, and we'd want to use this method if our licensing server doesn't have direct internet access. What this does is it allows us to fill in all the forms, pass that information over to another machine which does have internet access, and then we can submit it to Microsoft from that machine. Now finally, we could also use the trusty old telephone and just simply give them a call. All right, well, we are going to go with the automatic connection. We'll click Next. And then it's going to go off and contact Microsoft Activation Server over the internet. And it's going to come back and ask me to enter in some details about my company. So it's going to ask me for my first name, my last name, company name, and the country that we're located in. So you need to fill in all that stuff and then click Next. Now we'll need to fill in these fields as well. Well, actually, they're optional, truth be told. We could just click Next, but honestly, I'd fill them in. So they're pretty self-explanatory. Fill in your email, your company address, and so forth, and then simply click Next. Okay, well that was pretty quick. We've finished that part of the wizard, and if we leave this box checked, it's going to fire up a new wizard where we're able to install our licenses. So let's leave this box checked here. We're going to click Next. All right, that takes us straight into our next wizard where we can install our licenses and configure them. Let's click Next again. All right, now from this screen, we'll need to choose what sort of licenses we have. So from this drop-down window here, we can choose a retail purchase, an open license, or perhaps one of these agreements that we might have entered into. I'm going to go here with a retail purchase. I'll click Next. And at this point, I'm pretty much stuck here because obviously I haven't purchased these licenses for this video. But all you'd need to do here is to enter in your license codes that you were given from Microsoft and then click the Add button. then click Next, and run through the remainder of this short wizard. Now it's pretty easy, but of course it does require you to be getting your wallet out and buying those licenses. Alright, so I'm going to click Cancel here, and when we do that, you might have noticed that up here, thanks to the completion of our first wizard, we've now got an activated licensing server, and it shows this green tick instead of the red X. So once we add licenses to this server by running through that second wizard, this server would now automatically be able to issue those licenses to our user. Now, if, by the way, we didn't set up our licensing server to be automatically discovered, I just want to quickly show you how you can manually take your terminal server and point it to a licensing server. So let's go and open up the Server Management Console. We're going to expand Roles. We'll expand Terminal Services. Now we'll select Terminal Services Configuration. And in the middle of this window here, under this licensing heading, we can see that our licensed server discovery mode is currently set to automatic. So let's double click on this. In fact, if we double click on either of these two entries, by the way, it's going to open up the exact same window. So double click on either of them. It makes no difference which one you choose. And doing so is going to pop up this window here where we can set our licensing mode to per device or per user. And once we select either of these, we'll then be able to change our discovery mode from automatic to using a specific server, and we can simply type in the name of that server or servers if we have more than one of them. Just separate each server name or IP address by a comma, and that's it. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier to use the automatic discovery mode, which we've already got on this server, since we chose to use the forest-wide scope. Now, speaking of this discovery, by the way, since our licensing server is on the same server as our terminal server, it's going to automatically be discovered regardless of my scope setting. But if this were on a separate server, then it would either need to be on a domain controller or set to use a forest-wide scope for it to be automatically discoverable by all of our terminal servers. So in the situation where you leave the terminal server at a domain scope, and then you install the licensing server on any regular member server in your domain, then you'll need to come into here and configure the names of the server manually, as auto discovery just won't work. So obviously, to make things easier, Microsoft recommends that you do set your licensing servers to use a forest-wide scope. Now, one final thing I should mention is that when we came into this window, we hadn't yet configured the licensing mode. We had it set up the top here to not yet configured. So when we came into here, we had to choose to set it up as per device or per user. Now, it's not really a problem because I've only got one terminal server, but if you've got several of them, then you're going to probably want to set this up using group policy. So I've just switched over to my domain controller so we can have a look at how we can set this up in group policy. So let's go and click Start. We're going to fire up Administrative Tools and go to our Group Policy Management Console here. Now let's expand our forest, domains, our domain, and I'm just going to use my default domain policy to show you this. So I'll right click on that and choose Edit. Now under the Computer Configuration heading, I'm going to expand Policies. Then I'll expand Administrative Templates, Windows Components. Now let's just expand this. We'll then, see if I can move this here, we'll expand Terminal Services, followed by Terminal Server, and then we'll choose Licensing. Now over here in the right hand side of our console, you can see we have 3 policies, none of which are configured right now. The one we're looking for is the bottom one to set the Terminal Services licensing mode. So we're going to right click on this, we're going to choose Properties. I'll set this to Enabled, and then from our drop down box here, we'll select either a per device or per user mode. Now that's it, pretty easy. And now all of our terminal servers can then apply this policy, and we only need to configure this once, which is certainly much easier than running around to potentially dozens of different terminal servers. Now actually, whilst we're still here, let's just click Cancel here and take note of this top policy. Use the specified terminal services license servers. Now if we right click on this one and choose Properties, in here, if we choose to enable this policy, we're also able to set up the license servers. Now recall, We showed you how to do that manually a moment ago if we weren't using forest-wide scopes for our licensing server. Well, if that were the case, we could set up all of our licensing servers in this list here and apply those settings via group policy as well. Much, much easier than doing this all manually. So use group policy wherever you can if you don't have automatic discovery configured. So in this video, we've talked about licensing our terminal server. Now, as we saw when we installed terminal services, though, you do get 120 days grace to use terminal services before you need to install your licenses. But on the last day, if you haven't set up licensing and purchased your real licenses, you simply won't be able to connect to your terminal server. So it's a good idea to set yourself a calendar reminder, or better yet, simply do it now and avoid the pain of your terminal servers stopping unexpectedly. So we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.